Life is funny. The way things work out, how we meet people, why we get that job, where we end up going to school, how we get inspired, who we end up marrying. Those things all come down to what feels like a seemingly random sequence of events. Those significant hits and misses in life are often traced back to a very odd string of things. I never go home that way, but that day for some reason, ... I wasn't even supposed to work that night, but she called off and my supervisor called me in and ... For better or for worse, these string of events lead us to either being in the wrong place at the wrong time or the absolute right place at the right time. Why it happens and the outwardly small decisions that we made that could have prevented it seem almost crazy. Some call it chance. Others might call it fate or the will of the universe. But when you call it God's will, well, then that feels like a wholly different thing altogether. We can't tell you how many conversations that we have had with folks, with you, telling us a story of something that has happened to you or to someone you knew. Whether it was a tragedy or a blessing, we talk about it, we get into it, and we try to get to the bottom of what it all means and how we make sense of where God is leading us. And that's some of life's most significant questions. When we're approached, especially in the face of something that is really terrible, it may seem strange, but we count it an honor to be asked the question of, why did this happen? Now today we look at the story of Jonah, both in his resistance and willingness to comply with God's commands. And that gets at the heart of this very profound inquiry. Jonah's journey covers the gamut. I mean, really think about it. Why me? Why them? Why now? How could I possibly? How could you do this? One of the things we love about this story is how real and relatable his reactions are. He's angry. He's defensive, he's confused, he's frustrated, he's whiny, he's irrational, he's stubborn, he's judgmental, just like me and you. The things that we struggle with in our everyday life.
The story's amazing. Jonah's called by God to speak a word of truth to his enemies. He sails in the opposite direction, attempting to avoid the situation altogether. He steps up to take the blame for the storm, only to be thrown overboard and swallowed up by the big fish. The fish carries him to his destination, throwing him up on the shore, where God again speaks to him, reiterating the urgency of his message. After he tells them, after our text for today, his lament when God actually spares the Ninevites is so revealing and shocking that all you can do is shake your head. Any of these points in the story could and have been and will be sermons, but for now, it's not Jonah that we want to focus on, but the people of Nineveh. Their response to one man from far away yelling to the masses about fire and brimstone somehow on that day made all the difference. Nineveh was the capital city of the Assyrian Empire, an enormous kingdom situated in what is now Iraq. Jonah lives at a time when the might of these people was matched only by the Egyptians. This is the empire that would take the northern kingdom of Israel into exile, obliterating 10 tribes of the Hebrew people from the face of the earth, forever reducing the remnant that would eventually reclaim the land. The desolation that the Assyrians would inflict on Israel would be catastrophic and irreversible. And for the people of Israel, like the Babylonians after them, the Assyrians were the definition of overwhelming, devastating power and force. Considering the humanity of a people that Scripture describes at one point as wicked is an interesting endeavor. My mind instantly wanders to what makes up such an empire as this. Who are these people? Rulers, generals, and slave owners for sure, but not just that. It's also made up of mothers and fathers and children and grandchildren, shop owners, bakers, teachers, students. All of these people were Ninevites too. All of the people were part of a system that has, on one hand, abused its power, but on the other, God considers worth sparing. The Ninevites are example of a people at the height of their status and influence. They had every resource at their fingertips. Their political, economic, and social structures were well in place. These were people who knew who they were, a well-oiled machine, a nation of prosperity and authority. The idea that one person could just walk into their capital, give a few brief statements about what his God was going to do, and change the hearts and the minds of the people in virtually an instant is even more insane than it sounds, because Jonah was from Israel, an inferior nation, small in size and power. They were more of an annoyance than a legitimate threat. This plan made no sense. Even if Jonah wouldn't have despised them, he should have had no realistic expectation that his efforts would make any difference.
We can't tell you exactly what happened that day. We can't really even explain to you why the message was received, why the city repented, or why God even saw something in them that they should be. As someone who's made their vocation sharing the good news with God's people, both of us, we are perhaps more than a bit envious. Nothing that we could have said or done has come close anywhere near to having the kind of impact that Jonah had on that day. But of course, in other ways, it's quite inspiring that even someone as skeptical as Jonah could be used by God to spare an entire city. This is, of course, a very important image, since too often we approach our faith or the ministry of the church with not the right attitude. We're distracted or we're jaded. Meetings become just meetings and cumbersome. Those luncheons are just food and coffee, which eventually we'll have again. We need to be reminded that God is working, moving among us, presenting us with opportunities to change people's lives. So what did the Ninevites see? What was it that Jonah and his words said that was so dead spot on? What made this the right place and the right time? Well, we don't have a good answer for that question either. Who knows? Maybe the people were starting to see the error of their ways. Maybe there was social unrest, a movement of individuals who were fed up with business as usual, people fighting for change and a better way of life, people who saw the direction that their nation was headed as a curse and not a blessing. So Jonah's words swept through them like a breeze, like a breath of fresh air. Maybe Jonah was able to summarize and put into words exactly the way the dreamers were feeling, but never knew how to express. Perhaps Jonah had what everyone was thinking distilled down, but those people were afraid to say it, because once they did, they knew that life was never going to go back to the way it was. But of course, we know that regardless of our speculation, that God knows why. That God is the author of grace and also the author of any goodness and faith that lies within any one of us. It is God that stirs us up with the courage to respond to the love that God offers to us, to give us the ears to hear, the hearts prepared to recognize the need for God in the first place. We know that it was the Spirit who was acting and moving in the city that day. We know that it wasn't anything that Jonah did to save the people, that he was only the messenger. He was a vessel that God would use to ensure that God's will was done. Jonah didn't show up at the right place at the right time. God did.
I can only speak for myself, but I am far too often in the exact place that the Ninevites found themselves, and I would extend to you to consider that perhaps that's true for you too, and for us together. We need a word of truth. We need someone to remind us that God is seeking us out, claiming us, offering love and forgiveness. In those moments when I am left to wondering why awful things sometimes happen, I need to be reminded that it's not God's will that people would suffer, that brokenness is a result of a broken world, and that God grieves with me and you, sitting beside us through times of pain. We need people by word and deed who remind us that I am not, you are not, we together are not, in fact, the center of the universe, that not all of our actions are justifiable, that we are not, if we are not advocating for change, for fairness, then we're living as part of the problem when we're called to be part of the solution. We need a Jonah, an advocate, a counselor, a friend who God places in our lives at the right time to wake us up to a life that we were born to live. We're being asked to trust something. We're being asked to be open to a message that we may not always be ready to hear. A message, if we say yes to, then it may mean that we can never go back to the way things were before. Our challenge for you and for me and for all of us is that we allow ourselves to be moved by voices that we're not accustomed to paying attention to ideas that might at first scare us, to ways of being that might reshape who we are and may allow us to love and grow and see the world anew. We need to keep our eyes open for individuals who challenge the status quo, which might mean that we need to let go of the reins a little. Now, not every new or different idea is a good one. New for its own sake doesn't always mean better. Sometimes staying the course is what's faithful. But we must all be willing to ask ourselves, does my way of thinking, our way of thinking and acting, do the judgments we make or the attitudes that we hold on to genuinely demonstrate God's love for people? Are we showing others the same grace that God has shown us? Are we ensuring that all of those that we meet know the joy of God for themselves? That despite our faults and our missteps, God continues to invite us all to the table to know and be known by Christ and to live holy lives as individuals and together who can lift others up, allowing the Spirit to guide us. Now is the right time and place to be made new by the God that calls us by name, meeting us exactly where we are, and refuses to leave us alone. Who are those people for you? Who's been tugging at you to recognize something that you have ignored? Who sees the world completely differently than you do? Someone who may not think like you or look like you, but is clearly making a difference and loving in extraordinary ways. Our prayer is that we would all recognize the Jonah in our midst and never be afraid to step out in faith to live as chosen people who recognize that God is still moving, still forgiving, still flipping the world as we know it upside down by the power of his unyielding love. May it always be so. And to God be the glory this day and forevermore.
Indeed.
Amen.
Amen.